Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland, and here I am at Chartwell in Kent, which is Winston Churchill's country seat. So this goes back to a 14th century estate. Obviously none of the buildings are original, it's mostly 19th century what you can see here. And we're overlooking the Weald of Kent, which is a forest. We're not very far south of London. And I'll show you a bit of the vista. Probably can't see it quite so well with the naked eye. The trees are tinged as the land tapers away towards the horizon. Although we're actually looking down in the direction of the coast. There's maybe the hills just before you get to Eastbourne. Eastbourne's due south of here. Or indeed, we're not very far from Brighton either. Eastbourne, God's waiting room as they called it. A lot of people who retired from colonial service used to live there. The satanic Dr. John Bodkin Adams used to live there, who had a penchant for bumping off his very affluent patients from the 1930s to the 1950s, but that's another story. He was charged with murder just after Churchill retired as Prime Minister. Anyway, so back to Chartwell. Why it's called Chartwell I don't actually know. So he purchased this house and estate in the year of grace of 1900s 2 and 20. The Cahoon Campbell family had owned it for 3 generations, and I'm not quite sure what was on the market. It was obviously just after the First World War. Death duties had increased. It might have been something to do with that. A huge amount of land changed hands shortly after the First World War, partly because of the Land Registration Act. Here you can see it, the very extensive landscape gardens as well. He was quite keen on gardening, bricklaying. There's a wall which he largely built, but we're not going to see on this tour. So as you can see, it's very commodious. I'm not sure what style that is in. I think it's not a beautiful building, it's fair to say. It's not horrid either. It's rather on the plain side. There's a Chartwell school in Belgrade. As a British school, as named after Churchill's country estate, because he helped the Yugoslavs a bit during the Second World War. His son Randolph was out there with a special operations executive. His son Randolph, who served with the parachute regiment in the Second World War, and his son told him actually the communist partisans are much better at fighting than the Chetniks, are actually committed to the anti-fascist cause. The Chetniks, these royalists in Yugoslavia, were really Serbian nationalists rather than Yugoslavian nationalists, and sometimes mind to cut a deal with the Italians and Germans, whereas the partisans, the communist ones, their hostility was outright. So I'm not sure what you call this little alcove or something. This, it's not quite a room. Anyway, we see Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, his ancestress, who lived in the late 17th century into the early 18th century. You see the motto of this noble family, Fiel Pero Desicado, faithful but unlucky. And then you see this battle scene from Blenheim, as in his ancestors' most illustrious victory, the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, won the Battle of Malplaquet, Oudenarde, and others. So then we see Marlborough, as in the first Duke of Marlborough, Churchill's ancestor. The 7th Duke was Churchill's grandfather, the 8th Duke his uncle, the 9th Duke his cousin, the 10th Duke his first cousin once removed, and so forth. It's still going today. The Marquis of Blandford is the courtesy title for the heir to that great name. The current Marquis of Blandford is a cokehead, so the present Duke has entailed the estate away, so that when his son inherits, his son gets the title. You can't disinherit with that, but won't get the property and just blow it all on drugs or something. So look at these riders being unhorsed and so on. And so who else is here? Here we have Anne R for Regina. Queen Anne was the monarch at the time. She was married to George, Duke of Denmark, hence the Prince of Denmark's March, which was composed by Jeremiah Clarke, who was the organist of St Paul's Cathedral. That air was famously played in 1981, that July, when Princess Diana walked up the aisle of St Paul's Cathedral for her wedding to Prince Charles. She's of course a collateral descendant of Winston Churchill. Remember, Churchill's name is actually Spencer Churchill, but at Harrow School the boys had to process in alphabetical order. He didn't like being so far down the alphabet, so went by Spencer Churchill. And look here, so here we have Prince Eugen, who was their ally at the Battle of Blenheim, or Eugene as it's in English. And ironically, there was a German battleship called Prince Eugen, during the Second World War. So he visited Germany to help himself research. Churchill visited to research a biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. So he was a happy warrior, Churchill. And in 1932, he even arranged to have tea with Adolf Hitler, but the last minute Hitler had to cancel. The two men never actually met. And in a book, Great Contemporaries, published in 1936, Hitler was warmly described by Churchill. Churchill had even been to Italy in the early 1920s, and he indeed had orated before a fascist rally and said if he were an Italian, he would be amongst you. He adulated Mussolini as a great lawgiver, and so on. So fascism in the 20s didn't have the foul reputation it has today. It was seen as, well, some sort of blend between conservatism and socialism, certainly hyper-nationalistic. But communism was perceived as the mortal peril to civilization, not fascism back then. Okay, so a little walled garden he had here. So Churchill, he married Clementine Hosier, if memory serves, in 1911. And they were blessed with 5 children, Diana being the eldest. And Marigold was the one who died at the age of 3. Randolph was only son, who went to Eton because Churchill loathed Harrow and his prep school. St George's Ascot is now a girls' secondary school. That's why Winston decided his son Randolph would go to Eton. But neither were particularly academic because Latin and Greek were the focus of schooling in those days. And Churchill said, these clever boys, I would let them learn Latin if they were good and Greek for a treat, but I would make them learn English first of all, and if they made a mistake I would whip them and whip them hard. And so he said he got into his bones what a British sentence is. He did say British, not English. The other thing is, in his youth, the most famous Winston Churchill was an American novelist. No relation. So that's why our Winston Churchill is known as Winston S. Churchill, the S for Spencer, to avoid confusion with the American novelist. After Winston Churchill's lifetime, it went like this. The names went Randolph Winston, Randolph Winston, Randolph Winston, down to this day. Obviously, the famous Winston Churchill, his father was Lord Randolph Churchill, as in the youngest son of the Duke of Marlborough. So Churchill had some financial difficulties in the 20s and 30s. You say difficulties, but he was still a very wealthy man compared to most people. He said he was never so poor that he couldn't afford a magnum of champagne for himself and another one for a friend. So he was the best paid journalist in the world, and he got a lot of book deals, like The World Crisis. He published The River War about fighting in the Sudan, published My Early Life, things like that. And then after the Second World War, he kept his archives and he was able to use those to write his 6-volume history of the Second World War, with volume names like The Gathering Storm, Their Finest Hour, The Hinge of Fate, and so forth. So he published all those. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature by obviously the Swedish Academy in if memory serves, 1954. So he was a multi-talented person, and he'd won this public school competition for fencing. Public school meaning fee-paying schools, counterintuitively. And he also won a prize for declaiming the entirety of Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay's The Lays of Ancient Rome, as in, oh, how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his father and the fathers and the temples of his gods. Yes, it says fathers, plural, but I think we're to understand this means ancestry. They're using poetic license. So it's shut, so you have to book the time you're going to come here. Quite narrow timescale you're allowed in, and that's partly because they social distancing with coronavirus is still quite busy, especially given the time of year. So this is the butterfly house. Maybe it really was a house at some point. So one of his peculiar enthusiasms was for butterflies since his earliest childhood. And he used to hunt them when he was in the northwest frontier of India, i.e. Pakistan. It's now called the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and so on. So he smoked loads of Cuban cigars, but he often gave the leftover bits to his groundsman. He lived well. Obviously, had various London residences. He lived in Connaught Square in the 1920s, and the Irish Republican Army was trying to assassinate him because they knew he drove from there to the House of Commons every morn to bump him off in Hyde Park. And you really were allowed to drive through Hyde Park in those days, not what the road is today, but what we now consider a path, because of course, in the 1920s, very few people had cars. So he held so many positions in government, like President of the Board of Trade, Secretary of State for the Colonies, he'd been Under Secretary for the Colonies, Home Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer, obviously Prime Minister, Minister for War during the Second World War. About the only top job he didn't have was Foreign Secretary. And indeed, in the late 20s, when he told he was going to be Chancellor, he thought there must have been Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Chancellor of the Duchy of Cornwall. He couldn't believe there was going to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, And that's when he took the fateful decision in the late 20s to go back onto the gold standard, because the United Kingdom had come off it during the First World War, because until that time you could go to a bank and exchange your pounds sterling for an amount of gold, or indeed go into any bank and exchange gold for a number of pounds, shillings, pence, whatever it was. And that gave people immense confidence in the currency, because what is a banknote? It's a piece of paper with some ink on it. It's got no intrinsic value, but if you know it's exchangeable for gold, which for millennia people have thought has economic value, then you believe that it's worth something. You trust that it's exchangeable for goods and services. But so the UK went back onto the gold standard in the late 1920s. A lot of people said it was cataclysmic because it made exports too high, made unemployment rather too high. Now Churchill, against his better judgment, had gone along with the expert advice on it. And the UK obviously came out of it in the Second World War. The United States came off it in the early 70s under Nixon, and then the gold standard, the whole idea is gone these days. The other thing about the gold standard is it would avoid hyperinflation, which places like Germany had suffered in 1923. Anyway, the UK's never had a hyperinflation since. I know the pound's lost a lot of value the past sort of 5 years, but that's because of Brexit. Now, losing value can be good. What's the right value? It's debatable. See his croquet lawn here. So there's also his studio where he painted a lot, because he'd never painted anything until the age of 40, and then he found that was a wonderful way to de-stress. In the Second World War, he painted only one painting ever. He was in Morocco, then a French colony, for some reason. As you can imagine, from 1939 to 45, he had other matters to occupy him. At the beginning of the First World War, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, as in the cabinet minister in charge of the Admiralty, and he was given the same position at the outbreak of the Second World War. So Neville Chamberlain appointed him there. That thought that was stiffened the spine of the fighting services, and a message was sent out to all units of the Royal Navy, just simply 3 words: Winston is back. And they had no doubt which Winston they're talking about. So this is the front of Chartwell. So you're not allowed into all the rooms, so you can see what a splendid and comfortable house it is, but I think you'll agree it's not exquisite on the outside, very commodiously furnished. Anyway, so some people said he should have retired at the end of the Second World War. His wife Clementine was on him to do so, but he declined to do so. He led the Conservatives into a defeat in July 1945. People blamed the Conservatives for mass unemployment in the 1930s. Labour was swept to victory. I mean, they won quite a lot of seats. They won the vote, but not by a huge percentage, about 8 percentage point margin. The Liberals were reduced to only 12 seats, and at that time, the Liberals were a significant political force. Things like Welsh, Scots separatism were very minor in those days. In Northern Ireland, obviously, there was nationalism, but the Ulster Unionist Party was really an adjunct to the Conservative Party at that time. So, yeah, Churchill. I mean, in London, he first of all lived just off Edgware Road when he was a child, and then Connaught Square, when his house in his adulthood was a little further away. He lived at a number of addresses in London. He lived right beside Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral, in the 1930s. Hyde Park Gate was where he died, which is just south of Hyde Park, very close to Royal Albert Hall. Now you can see his one of his fish ponds here. There's a photo of him, I'm not sure it's on this pond, where he's walking across various stepping stones. So their woods beyond were the Canadian camp and their bomb crater, which they turned into a little bit of a playground. The crater obviously been far deeper in Churchill's lifetime, because every time it's rained since the 1940s, some mud's been washed into it. And there are various little wicker work seats and almost huts in the woods beyond. Now this is giant hogweed, which I don't know if it grows outside of Ireland and Great Britain, and if you touch that on bare skin and then it's exposed to the sunlight, then it tends to burn, so watch out. I'll show you about giant hogweed, because the little children like to hide in it, because it looks a bit like jungle when they're playing hide and seek and things like that. I was warned about that when I went to prep school in North Britain when I was little. So there's some ponds here which are not man-made. There's a cafe, there's a gift shop and so forth. So it's a National Trust property. If you're a member of the National Trust, you can come here free of charge. So that's just a little bit about Chartwell, which is well worth a visit if you've got the remotest interest in Churchill or indeed British history. So really all you can see is owned by him, or was owned by him, and was conveyed to the National Trust in 1946 when he was in dire financial straits, which is a highly relative term for such a wealthy man. He then got a book deal worth, in modern terms, £21 million, right after the war, so perhaps he wasn't really that stony broke. So I've more or less done a full circle back to the front of Chartwell. I say front, this is not the door that most visitors would go in. I'm not sure where the tradesman's entrance was. So we're near, is it Wareham is the nearby town? So Kent, in case you don't know, is just outside London to the southeast. So it's on the coast, the southeastern corner of the United Kingdom. So he's warden of the Cinque Ports towards the end of his life, or right up until the day he died, which, as I may point out, was really an honorary position to be in charge of these several ports on the southern coast of England. It goes back to the Middle Ages when there was a lot of fighting against France, and these towns had been a posture of defence in case the French raided, and to equip warships to fight in the English Channel. But because of the Second World War, he was given that office in, I think, 1940, the same year as he became Prime Minister. It was the 10th of May 1940 he became Prime Minister. Perhaps significantly happened to be the same date that the Indian Mutiny had erupted in 1857. And you might remember he was very immoderate in his views on Hindustan. He set his face like flint against the least concession to Indian nationalism, thought there shouldn't be any moves towards self-governance, although, having said that, in the 1920s he had consented to some of these as colonial secretary, but by the 1930s was fulminating against them, seemed to be thundering like an Old Testament prophet. So by the 30s he was increasingly fossilized. People thought he's a dinosaur, his best days are behind him, he's just a cantankerous old sort, we'll just ignore him. And then of course he became Prime Minister at the age of 66. And obviously he served on as Prime Minister until the age of 80, only standing down in May 1955. There was a 6-year hiatus of Clement Attlee's Labour government in between. So I'll just show you where that studio is, where he painted over 500 works. All but 5 of them down there are by Churchill. So that building yonder, that's his studio. So that's enough from me. I really need donations to keep this going, so please give most liberally to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's all small letters. Callahan spelled Callaghan. I teach all sorts of subjects online, and I translate and I help you with documents, editing, whatever it is, personal statements, covering letters. I'll help you with elocution, interview practice, things of that nature. Right, toodaloo.